So last week we covered the invention of the spinning reel, and I mentioned that the first spinning reels were limited because there was no fishing line at the time that could take full advantage of the new reels. Enter Frederick Kekule. This was back in the 1800s when scientists were just beginning to figure out the basics about atoms and how atoms were arranged into molecules in specific ratios and at specific angles. Kekule was better than anyone else at figuring out all these angles, so you might say he was the best angler of his era. Anyway, the early chemists had figured out how a lot of the simpler molecules were built. Water is just one atom of oxygen with two atoms of hydrogen attached slightly off to one side. Cyanide is an atom of carbon attached to an atom of nitrogen, and methane is one carbon bonded onto four hydrogens. But nobody could figure out how to design a model of the huge, complicated carbon-based molecules, the stuff that life is made out of. They knew that molecules were like Lego sets. The atoms only fit together in exact ways. And they kept trying to envision long chain carbon molecules by adding more stuff onto the ends of the chain. The single bond, double bond pattern of carbon atoms was like the backbone of a snake. But no matter how long they made this theoretical snake, they could not get it to account for the complex molecules they were discovering in nature. So one day, old Kekule was daydreaming on the bus on the way to work. Now, of course, normal people like you and me, we daydream about fishing, but Kekule was not normal. He daydreamed about chemistry. And one day on that bus, he had his famous vision of the Ouroboros, the snake that eats its own tail. And he began to think, what if these carbon chains were not linear at all? What if they curled around and attached back onto themselves, like the Ouroboros? So this Ouroboros dream led right to his vision of the indole ring, and the rest, as they say, is plastic. 6 carbon atoms arranged in a hexagon with hydrogens or whatever else you wanted attached to the outside, which led directly to the discovery of the benzene ring and the revelation that these carbon ring structures could be attached onto each other into long chains, which basically was the start of what we call organic chemistry, which led to a few things that you might find useful, like gasoline and nylon and plastic. So the next time your boss gives you a hard time for daydreaming on the job, you remind him of the great Kekule and the Ouroboros. Now, of course, Kekule was indirectly responsible for a lot of really bad stuff, like that horrid fake AstroTurf grass the Toronto Blue Jays have to play on, and the giant phony plastic boobs on young women who are not satisfied with the body that God gave them, and that huge vortex of plastic junk floating out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But we have to give Kekule a pass on this one because he was also responsible, indirectly, for the creation of the best bass lure ever, the rubber worm. In fact, most bass lures today are made out of plastic. But maybe even more important, the work of Kekule and the other great organic chemists also led to the invention of nylon and other fibers, which were huge improvements over previous fishing lines. They spent their lives slaving away in laboratories, crunching obscenely complicated equations without computers. They engaged in great rivalries, and a surprising number of them went totally bonkers, and some even ended up committing suicide. They made a great sacrifice so that one day we could go out on the Basstravaganza and catch giant bass on topwater plugs. The highest quality fly line in the days of Dame Juliana Berners and Isaac Walton was made of silk. They would boil the cocoons of the silkworm moth and then unwind the cocoon and braid the silk strands together to make strong, flexible fishing line. But this braided silk line was opaque, so it was easy for the fish to see it. So onto the end of the main fly line, the fly fishers added a piece of line that was thinner and clearer. This was called a leader. It was made of the same material by a different process. They would drop the live caterpillars into boiling water before they spun their cocoons, and then cut the boiled caterpillars open and extract the glands that produced the silk. Now, the silkworms were not really happy about this plan, and they filed a grievance, but nothing came of it. Anyway, they would stretch these silk glands out, and the raw silk would gel into a clear fiber, just a single clear strand. And the longer they stretched these glands, the thinner the fiber would be. They could stretch these silk glands out to 3 or 4 or 5 or even 6 feet. They called it silkworm gut, and they would tie a thick section of this gut onto the fly line and then tie thinner and thinner sections onto the end of that to make a leader. Now, nowadays, we don't have to behave like fly fishermen and torture caterpillars and boil cocoons to make fishing line, and we don't have to braid kelp and stinging nettles. Modern line is really flexible, it's really thin, really strong, and it's almost invisible, and it's really cheap. So if we tie a weighted lure onto the end of this strong, flexible line, we can use the rod to throw the lure out to a great distance and use the mechanical marvel of the multiplying reel to retrieve it. And we've left the orangutans and the fly fishermen and the bait casters way behind and reached the age of modern fishing. So now we have a modern rod, a modern reel, some modern line. We only need one more thing to start catching fish: a lure. And we're going to start by fishing for bass. So we need a bass lure. And because this is the Basstravaganza, where we worship the surface strike, we will start out with a surface bass lure. Because here at the Basstravaganza, we believe that fooling the wily bass into grabbing our lure off the surface is the culmination of the fisherman's craft. But first, allow me to digress. You people out there in video land, you're so passive. All you do is sit there and watch. You absorb like sponges. I want a show that's interactive and gets the viewers involved. So I have a plan, okay? Now, we have all these mountains in Canada, eh? They used to be good for skiing in the winter, and they'd hold snow in the summer that would melt off and feed the trout streams. But now with global warming, there's no more snow, so the mountains are just kind of sitting out there and not doing anything. Nobody's really using them. Now, down south in the U.S., they don't just let extra mountains sit around doing nothing. They find a way to market them. Now, they have this one they call Pikes Peak, where they built a road right to the top so they can have a road race there every year. It's interesting. This mountain was named after a guy who was named after a fish, General Zebulon Pike, and he actually died while he was invading Canada. He was leading U.S. troops trying to sack and burn the city of Toronto when he was killed by an explosion started by his own men. And who knows, if that explosion had not occurred, they might not be singing "O Canada" nowadays before every Blue Jays game. And in some places down there, they take extra mountains and carve big heads into them, kind of like the people on Easter Island used to do. On one mountain, they carved the heads of 4 of their local heroes. They call it Mount Rushmore. Now, there are some pretty dubious characters up there. Warmongers and slave owners and political bagmen, and heck, half of them probably invaded Canada. The other half were probably thinking about it. And nearby to Mount Rushmore, they have another mountain that they're carving into a giant statue of one of my heroes, the Native American known as Crazy Horse. And who knows, the way things are going down there, they might start carving mountains into Kim Kardashian or the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. So I got to thinking, here in Canada, we have all these mountains we're not using. Why not get a bunch of bass fishermen together? You people out there in video land, you're not doing anything, just sitting there watching the show. So we'll get some bass fishermen and we'll rent some jackhammers, and some stormy night when nobody's watching, we'll climb up to the top of one of those mountains that nobody's using, and we'll chisel out that mountain into the heads of real Basstravaganza heroes. And we won't allow any warmongers up there and no slave owners. And in fact, because it's my show, I'm going to make an executive decision right now and declare that there will be no politicians, period. We need real heroes, leaders of unquestioned brilliance and impeccable moral virtue. So I got to thinking, who could we choose that would represent the kind of values that all Canadians, that people all over the world could revere and respect? And then it hit me. We'll carve that mountain into the heads of 4 great heroes of bass fishing. And not any old bass fisherman, because we worship the surface strike here at the Basstravaganza. We'll carve that mountain into the heads of 4 great heroes of topwater bass fishing. And if you don't like that choice of heroes, get your own show. Now, one of the problems with the folks from the great Colossus to the south is that they're always in a rush. You know, the world would be a better place if they weren't always rushing around the world, invading people and overthrowing governments for the sake of their empire. So when I first thought this plan up, I thought I was going to call our Canadian mountain Mount Rush Less, you know, just to set an example. But then it hit me like a flash. We need a positive name that will provide guidance and inspiration for everyone. So we won't call our mountain Mount Rush Less. We'll call it Mount Fish More. So now we've got a plan. And the first thing we need to do is select our 4 great heroes that we'll carve up onto Mount Fishmore. And because the Basstravaganza worships the surface strike, for our 4 heroes, we're going to select the people who invented the 4 greatest topwater bass lures in history. The Rapala, the Buzzbait, the Jitterbug, and the Zara Spook. And we're going to start right now by learning about the spook. In Pensacola, Florida, on the Gulf of Mexico, right next to Alabama, the main street that runs along the water is called Main Street. And the street right behind is called Zaragoza Street. Now, Pensacola used to have a big Navy base and a big commercial fishing fleet back around the turn of the 20th century. And like a lot of places that had sailors and commercial fishermen hanging around, there were a group of women who would entertain these sailors when they were in town. And they had a special wiggle in the way they walked. And they liked to entertain so much, they put up red lights around the whole district where they worked. And in Pensacola, this district was located on Zaragoza Street. In 1917, there was a guy named Walter F. Biggs who ran a sporting goods store in Pensacola called Biggs and Kupfrian. And in winter, when fishing was slow, some of the fishermen would sit around the wood stove in the shop and shoot the breeze and whittle out new fishing lures. And one of these guys, it may have been Angelo Cappaduccia, but we're not sure, he made a lure by taking a round piece of wood and carving it into a point at each end. And then he put an eye on one end and attached a couple of triple hooks. His secret was that he embedded some lead weight into the rear end of the lure, so the head end floated but the tail sank. And here's a sample of a modern version. Millions of these are sold worldwide under the famous trademark brand name Spook. The magic of this lure comes from its action. Notice how the lure sits in the water at an angle with its tail down. Because it's stern heavy, when you jerk it forward, the heavy back end wants to keep pushing forward as the front end stops. So the rear end pushes the front end off to the side. It absolutely will not move in a straight line. And because it's riding at an angle, it keeps bobbing up and down all the time it's moving. It's like walking with a dog on a leash. The dog never wants to walk straight. It's always pulling off to one side and then the other. So this kind of retrieve is famous among bass fishermen the world over. It's called walking the dog, and it is diagnostic of the Spook. And if you talk about walking the dog with a different lure, you just sound like an idiot, pal. Anyway, this lure started catching fish and making a name for itself. And one of the other guys in the store said, "That minnow, it do the hoochie coochie just like the girls on Zaragoza Street." So the lure became known as the Zaragoza minnow because they misspelled the name of the street. Now over in Tampa, there was a guy named Grover Cox. His name will be on the midterm, so pay attention. His head is also going to get carved onto Mount Fishmore. Now, Grover Cox had a bicycle shop, and he branched out into making lures. He's credited with being the first person in Florida to make and sell bass lures. And here he heard about the lure they were making in Pensacola, and he started making his own version, and he called it the Tampa Minnow. And they caught fish. And he started selling them, and he was not shy about promoting them. Now, before we decide to carve Grover's head into the mountain, we need to make another slight digression and go back into time. In 1831, William Renniston built a dam across Dowagiac Creek in Michigan. It created a mill pond that powered sawmills and grain mills, and it gave birth to the town of Dowagiac. And that mill pond is still there today. And it's named the James Hedden Memorial Park. James Hedden was born in 1845 in New York, and he moved with his parents to Michigan. He used to go down to this pond with his father to eat lunch. They were both maniac fishermen, and James would carve little pieces of wood and throw them in the water and watch the bass swim up and grab them. So James grew up and he married the daughter of a beekeeper, and they started making sweet honey. He seems to be one of those guys who was just good at everything he did. He wasn't just good at raising bees, he was good at running a business. And pretty soon he was running the biggest honey business in the U.S. Plus he was head of the American Beekeepers Association. Plus he wrote a famous book about beekeeping in 1885, Success in Bee Culture. Plus he established the Hedden School of Apiary. Plus he was also editor and publisher of the Dowagiac Times newspaper. Plus he was the mayor of Dowagiac. So one day in 1902, James Hedden came home and said to his wife, "Honey," that's what he called her because they were beekeepers, right? He said, "Honey, I'm tired of wasting my life on shallow, trivial tasks. I'm going to dedicate my life to something important. I'm going to make bass lures." And she said, "Oh, that's unbelievable, honey. But did you ever stop to think that no one in the history of the world has ever made a living selling bass lures?" To which he replied, "Well, honey, maybe that's because they didn't use my lures." So he started carving out wooden lures and testing them in that mill pond there and selling them by mail. And pretty soon he became the John D. Rockefeller of lure making. For many years, Hedden was the biggest fishing lure company in the world, and the factory was right there in Dowagiac, and they still tested their lures right in that same pond. Anyway, back to Grover Cox. He had stopped making his Tampa minnows around 1920, and James Hedden either bought or stole the design, depending on who you talk to, and began producing it. And for over 40 years, Hedden sold it as the Zaragoza. In the 1960s, they started making them out of translucent plastic, so since you could see through them like a ghost, as a marketing gimmick, they changed the name to Zara Spook, and that's what they've been called ever since. Now, James Hedden invented a ton of lures himself. The River Runt and the Crazy Crawler and the Lucky 13 and the Crab Wiggler and the Spin Diver, and he sold millions of them, but they were all junk, and nobody uses them anymore, and none of them were nearly as good as the Spook. The Spook was a killer pattern 100 years ago, and it still is today. The Zara Spook is one of the 4 best topwater bass lures you can buy. But we can't put James Hedden up on Mount Fishmore because he didn't invent the Spook. So we'll chisel in Grover's head. And if anybody can ever document that it really was Angelo Cappaduccia who carved out the first Spook, and if there's a picture of Angelo anywhere we can use for reference, then we can always go up later, and most of the work is already done. We're bass fishermen. We can just chip away a little bit more and we'll change Grover's head into Angelo's. So next week, we'll actually go out on the water and try to catch some bass. But for now, let's watch this short clip just to prove that my homemade version of the Spook really does work. You can see I'm not fooling around here. I've got an 8.5-foot salmon rod rigged up with 30-pound test no stretch line and 20-pound test leader, so I can wing my lure a mile out. Bingo! That is a monster smallmouth bass. And that is a great start to a new season of topwater bass fishing. And it's always cool to see a lure I worked on all winter get smashed the first morning it hits the water. Well, that's all the time we have this week. Be sure to stay tuned for the next episode of the Basstravaganza.